Hello and welcome to First Talk with Violet Gonda. This week, SADC Electoral Observer Mission issued its final report on last month's elections in Zimbabwe, which declared the election free and credible and said it reflected the will of the people. The report has been widely criticized by the opposition and civil society organizations for glossing over shortcomings in the process. In particular, they mentioned that until now, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission has failed to provide, as required by law, an electronic copy of the voters' roll to opposition parties. The SADC Observers also recommended the shutting down of all external broadcasters such as SW Radio Africa, Studio 7 and First TV. Joining me to discuss these issues are Ozias Tungwarara, Director of the African Governance Monitoring and Advocacy Project, Human Rights Watch analyst Dewa Mavhinga, and later on we are going to be joined by Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition Regional Coordinator Joy Mabenge. So let me start with Dewa. What did you make of the report?
It brings out a number of challenges, particularly when you look at the SADC principles and guidelines on the conduct of democratic elections, which were the basis upon which the SADC Election Observer Mission to Zimbabwe was supposed to look at elections. It shows clearly that now SADC leadership has lowered its standards and bar in terms of what constitutes credible, free and fair elections. In fact, the language that is used by SADC conveniently avoids the idea of saying the elections were fair, but goes on to say they were free, peaceful and generally credible, which is quite unusual because in terms of the principles and guidelines, it's either they are fair or not fair, but SADC has not pronounced itself on this important matter and has not directly addressed a number of shortcomings that marred this election process. So these are the challenges that are emerging from this position by SADC, which dents its credibility.
Ozias?
Yeah, I think the so-called final statement by the SADC Observer Mission is a bit strange in a number of ways. Strange in that it seems to focus purely on election day happenings, while it comments on the context and environment within which the election happened. These factors do not seem to have been given their due weight in coming to an evaluative conclusion about the integrity of the Zimbabwean election. I think we need to put the SADC's role both in terms of Zimbabwe's transition or transitional arrangement that led to the July 31st election in context, because SADC had been presiding over certain very clearly articulated reforms that were supposed to have been undertaken in order to have an election that would be considered credible, or an election that would have been considered to have been held with integrity. The bulk of those reforms were not undertaken, and SADC in its observer mission does not now take those into account, particularly issues related to media reforms, issues related to security sector reforms, which in a lot of ways impacted on the credibility of the election. And SADC should have taken those into account, but it doesn't in its final evaluation of the election.
What about the fact that the observers actually measured the elections against the violent 2008 elections? What did you make of that? Ozias.
Yeah, I think it's a very low base to come from what happened in 2008. And we should recall that in 2008, SADC and the AU, even with their minimalist standards, were not able to certify the Zimbabwean elections then as an expression of Zimbabwean people's will. So to use that as a benchmark for the 2013 elections is unfortunate and tragic, because the absence of physical violence is not the same as peace. The cessation and the abating of bloodletting is welcome and commendable, but it shouldn't be the basis on which the credibility of the electoral process should be adjudged. I think Zimbabweans deserve better, and better even in terms of the standards that the different entities within SADC have come up with them for themselves to govern better. So there is no excuse for going below that bar.
And Dewa, coming back to you, what does generally credible mean? Isn't it you're either pregnant or not? Can you be part pregnant?
Sorry, come again, hello?
What does generally credible mean to you?
Well, what it means certainly is that there is a departure from the word credible. What it means is that there is a lowering of standards, because it means that election is not credible, but generally is a broad term which looks at other factors which are not strictly within the framework of SADC standards. This is why it is a dent on SADC's own credibility to try and find ways of accommodating Zimbabwe elections which were disputed and which were marred with a number of irregularities, which actually SADC noted but only put to recommendations for what should be done better in the future. But also the other challenge that has been there has been that in terms of a rejection of this outcome, it appears there was also need from within Zimbabwe, from the political parties that took part in this election, to be stronger and more robust in their rejection, so that they would strengthen SADC's hands in terms of coming out clearly that this election did not meet the standards.
But Dewa, wasn't it obvious that the observer mission was going to come up or come out with such a report, since the SADC heads of state had already endorsed President Mugabe and already endorsed the elections?
Well, in submitting the preliminary report, SADC did say that it was only preliminary and was awaiting further and fuller details from the observer missions in terms of, or as to the fairness of the election. So they had not dealt with the issue of whether or not the election was fair and credible. So this is why they then to look carefully at all the reports that came out. But again, even with that period of time of 30 days, they failed to pronounce the Zimbabwe election as fair, but fell short in terms of what needs to be done to ensure that there is redress.
And Ozias, don't you think that since they had already appointed President Mugabe as the next vice chair of SADC, or the new vice chair of SADC, that they had to do this to give him credibility?
Yeah, I mean, the whole behavior of SADC does not inspire a lot of confidence in terms of whether the regional body is committed to strengthening and consolidating democratic governance in Southern Africa, as is spelled out in its treaty and other commitments that it has ostensibly met, because it raises the issue whether there is any value at all in undertaking such an extensive exercise as sending in over 600 election observers whose findings and deliberations are clearly not being taken into account or are not influencing decision making within the regional body. So the message it sends is that election observation by SADC has clearly been reduced to a ritualistic exercise which is intended to make SADC look good, but is not intended to change the way in which things are done, because it is the same SADC that had expressed concern regarding the constrained time frame within which elections were being held, and it actually requested the Zimbabwean government to approach the court and ask for an extension. So that clearly spelled out that SADC was concerned about the appropriateness of the time frame within which elections were held. And therefore to then continue as if nothing was wrong, as if no observations had been done, and then endorsed Mugabe before any final report had been made, makes a fuss of the whole exercise of sending in people under the guise of observing. And I think this is a trend we are seeing across the continent, that elections as a vehicle or an arena for contestation over state power are being manipulated, and manipulated by incumbents who have also now established cross-border networks to legitimize the illegitimate.
So does this lower SADC guidelines, SADC standards on elections in the region? Because I understand that there are going to be about 7 other elections in the region between now and 2014. What are the implications of this?
I think it's unfortunate, Violet, that progressively SADC, the executive, has been consolidating its dominance of other sectors of governance, reflecting what is happening at national level. You will recall that the first grouping to develop electoral standards was the SADC Parliamentary Forum. And the SADC Parliamentary Forum standards are much more detailed and much more progressive than the SADC guidelines that were adopted in Mauritius in 2004. And you will recall that the SADC Parliamentary Forum in 2000, or rather was it 2002, declined to certify the Zimbabwean elections free and fair. And it is then that SADC, the executive, when it realized that also the Electoral Commission's forum within SADC had come up with very detailed and very progressive standards, came up with its own standards in 2004, which were intended to dilute the very advanced standards that the other bodies had been able to come up with. And when you look at the SADC standards that they are using, they are so general that you could drive a truck through them. So in essence, what we have seen is that SADC, the executive, has progressively undermined institutions of effective governance. So for instance, it deconstructed the SADC tribunal, and up to now, it has failed to recognize, for instance, the SADC Parliamentary Forum as an integral part of SADC, because SADC Parliamentary Forum comprises both opposition and ruling party members, and therefore it comes up with more balanced observations than SADC, the executive. So what we are seeing in SADC, and this is what is frightening for other upcoming elections, is a brotherhood that is progressively moving towards increased authoritarianism.
And Dewa, just going back to what the observers recommended, one of the issues was to do with the media. And they said that external radio stations such as SW Radio Africa and Studio 7, or rather external broadcasters, should be shut down. What did you make of that?
Well, I think there were two challenges. And the first one was that perhaps it was an attempt by SADC leaders to divert attention from the real issue, which was a failure to uphold their own standards. So one way of doing that and carry favor with the government of Zimbabwe, led by President Mugabe, was to focus on external radio stations so that ZANU-PF would see some kind of balance in the way in which SADC was presenting its report. The real issue had to do with public media, that public media should not be partisan towards ZANU-PF, but should be independent and impartial in the study of its duties. But because SADC was lowering its on this requirement, what then happened was that it then turned to private media, external media, as an equivalent to public media when it comes to polarization as to between ZANU-PF and the MPC. So this is the challenge that they failed to deal with, that the public media is partisan towards ZANU-PF and try to divert attention by looking at or calling for the closure of external radio stations.
Does the fact that they also touched a bit on ZBC, does that make any difference?
Well, what is clear, and what should be clear, is that ZBC, the Herald, and other state media are not equivalent to private media, because these are publicly owned, these are state-owned, and should not be viewed as the equivalent of private media in that they can be partisan towards ZANU-PF or any other party. So it does not make a difference, because SADC should have really addressed public media as it is, and then address the fundamental reasons why we have external radio stations in terms of the lack of freedom of expression, association, and access to information within Zimbabwe. That civil society activists, human rights defenders, and others are not free at the moment to express themselves without looking over their shoulders. This is why we have external radio stations. So it is about having an environment, a human rights environment conducive to the thriving of a robust, independent free media within Zimbabwe, and not to look at the symptoms, which is the existence of external radio stations.
So, Ozias, what do you make of that? Is it the business of the regional body to recommend the shutting down of external broadcasters?
No, not at all, Violet. And I think if one looks at it this way, that it's equivalent to Ian Smith in the 1970s asking for the closure of Voice of Zimbabwe broadcasting from Maputo. And Zimbabweans are not stupid. They know what is the truth. They know what is objective information, what is objective reporting. And it only indicates that the externally based radio stations are serving a critical role in the absence of alternative views that currently characterizes the media terrain in Zimbabwe. People do not just enjoy being based in South Africa, London, or the US to transmit into Zimbabwe. It was because of a deliberate, calculated, and conscious policy by the ZANU-PF government to shut out any other alternative voices that they now have to deal with people who have innovated and are broadcasting from outside the country. The moment they allow plural media that is unfettered, you will cease to find externally based radio stations. So again, SADC is well aware of these issues. They know the reasons why we have externally based radio stations. And rather than respond to that by way of insisting meaningful media reforms take place in Zimbabwe, they decide to take the path of least resistance, which is to call and clamor for the closure of a service that is providing a critical alternative across the country in rural areas. People listen clandestinely, albeit at night, to broadcasts from VOA, from shortwave radio, Africa, and so on and so forth. There is a need being served, and SADC has no place to be making that recommendation because it doesn't make sense at all.
But do you think if there was a strong opposition in the country, do you think that perhaps SADC would have been more balanced in its response?
Yeah, I think it would have been more progressive in its response, because again, you need to take stock of SADC's behavior. It responds according to the developments of the moment. You know very well that SADC refused categorically from the formation of the MDC to recognize it as a legitimate political player on the Zimbabwean political scene, led primarily by the former South African Thabo Mbeki. MDC would not be invited to sit at the table to present their case. And it was only through a protracted struggle that SADC was actually compelled to begin to recognize MDC as a player and began inviting them at the table. So the moment MDC faces a setback, we see again the patting on the back, the closing of ranks among the SADC executive club. And so unless and until, and again, I think people should not look at this setback as permanent, but as part of a development in the transition trajectory of Zimbabwe towards a more democratic society. So we may have taken a detour, but I think we'll still come back to the main road, and SADC will again be compelled to respond in an appropriate manner. But its track record is not inspiring in terms of being a balanced body that actually is objective and is committed to genuinely promote democratization in the region.
Dewa, I'll come back to hear your views on this, but let's take a short break, and then after we come back, we'll also be joined by Joy Mabenge from Crisis and Zimbabwe Coalition. Welcome back to First Talk with Violet Gonda. We are discussing the SADC Electoral Observer Mission's final report on last month's elections in Zimbabwe, which declared the election free and credible and said it reflected the will of the people. Our guests are Ozias Tungwarara, Director of the African Governance Monitoring and Advocacy Project, Human Rights Watch analyst Dewa Mavhinga, and Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition Regional Coordinator Joy Mabenge. Now, Joy, the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition issued a statement yesterday saying that the SADC Observer Mission's report is revisionist and smacks of a cover-up. Can you explain?
Yes, thank you, Violet, for inviting me. As the Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition, our position has always been very clear that SADC set guidelines and principles for their member states. And we expect each and every member state to fully comply with these guidelines and principles. Now, what we have coming from the SADC Election Observer Mission to Zimbabwe, as read out by Minister Membe, is a position where if it was an audit, it's a highly qualified audit. They are shying away from clearly declaring that this election was fair if it was. So they are very clear themselves that this election was not fair. They are very clear themselves that it was not credible. They are only clear that it was free because there was no violence. And as a civic movement, we are very concerned because that their statement signifies the significant lowering of standards. And we are saying, why lower standards for the Zimbabwean election when you know this election was highly contested, when you know this election was a high-stakes game, when you know that our expectation as Zimbabwe was for the country to return to legitimacy.
When you say cover up, what do you mean? What are they trying to cover up?
Yes, they are observers. The AU's observers, the SADC observers, did say that there were a lot of irregularities. They observed that there were irregularities concerning the voters' roll itself. There were irregularities concerning a high number of assisted voters. There were irregularities concerning quite a number of aspects pertaining to this election. And for them not to dig deeper into those aspects that would lead them to saying that this election was fair and sweep these under the carpet and cover this up by introducing new terms like generally credible. Definitely it shows that they know something that we all know in terms of the fairness of this election, in terms of the credibility that must be afforded this election. They are fully aware of these things and they have chosen to cover up instead of to have that regional body addressing these issues, and instead of going to the Zimbabwean election management body and the Zimbabwean authorities to say, because of these things, this election does not meet the SADC guidelines and principles governing democratic elections, and therefore recommend something other than to say that these must be addressed in the next election.
And, you know, just before the break, I asked Ozias Tungwarara if the opposition, if there was a strong opposition in Zimbabwe, do you think that perhaps SADC would have done a better job? And Dewa Mavhinga, how can you respond to this question? Do you think things would have been different if Zimbabwe had a strong opposition?
Well, what is clear is that SADC has a tendency to respond to visible actions or to crisis moments. If you look at the beginning of the mediation talks in Zimbabwe in March 2007, it was because of a very visible crisis triggered by the police brutality on Tsvangirai, Professor Maduku, and other civic leaders. So it was important that within Zimbabwe, the movement for democratic change, formations, and civil society make a clear statement of rejecting these elections and of making that a very visible position, which would have then perhaps have assisted SADC to be clearer in terms of where it stands, because SADC is more interested in the idea of stability and a semblance of legitimacy, and not necessarily in human rights values. It has a poor attitude towards human rights standards. You look at the SADC tribunal, the way it was shut down, shows that SADC standards are lowering and that SADC is not really committed to the values that it has put on paper, unless there is a clear and present crisis that shows that things are not well. So it would have been for the MDC formations and civil society to confront directly and show that all is not well in Zimbabwe in terms of the level to which they were rejecting the sham election, the electoral fraud of July 31 this year.
Now, Ozias, coming back to you, as Joy Mabenge said, the Tanzanian Foreign Minister Bernard Membe said that the elections were generally credible, but still SADC refused to mention the issue of fairness. But what I don't understand is how then can they, you know, accept the results of the elections when they are not prepared to say whether the election was fair or not? What can you say about that?
Yeah, I think, Violet, what we are seeing now is a diversion from real issues and hiding behind semantics, which actually can be seen through. Because what should have happened is that the SADC Observer Mission, after and the AU Observer Mission as well, after highlighting the shortcomings that were raised around this election, should have made an assessment whether such shortcomings were fatal to the credibility, fairness, freeness, and integrity of the whole electoral process. They should not simply have preoccupied themselves with there was a peaceful, conducive environment in which people could cast their ballots, because the ballot day and simply dropping your ballot into the ballot box is not all there is to an election. And therein lies the serious shortcomings of the SADC evaluation. So just one thing that stands out, and which was known to SADC, is that this was not an ordinary routine election. This was an election that was a culmination of a very contested process, which was the government of national unity and the global agreement that was supposed to usher in a transition, given what happened in 2008. Mm-hmm. And everyone knows what happened in 2008. Zimbabwe had failed to conduct an election as a country, and therefore called in SADC and others to come and assist. So the test for the credibility of this election, like I think Joy and Dewa have said, the stakes were so high. And so if reform such as a credible, impartial judiciary was not in place, and we had seen prior to that how the court had acted in the run-up to the election, when a Chief Justice inserts commas and colons in the text of the Constitution in order to come up with a certain outcome. All those were pointing to an environment that was poisonous. And SADC should have weighed these issues. The whole issue around the manipulation of the voter register was critical, because then it disenfranchised a whole a broad spectrum of Zimbabweans from voting. And once you disenfranchise a lot of citizens, the credibility of the election falls into question, because people cannot access their right to vote. And so on what basis then is SADC saying this election was credible? Simply because of voting day?
Mm-hmm. So, Joy, we have heard all these complaints about what SADC failed to do. So what is the way forward then?
Well, the way forward really, Violet, is the first point that I need to make is that the behavior by SADC on this Zimbabwean election shows that citizens now do not have regional recourse. Citizens in fragile states and citizens in nations in crisis seemingly do not have recourse to regional intervention, like regional diplomacy, when it comes to resolving these issues. As Zimbabweans, we had put in so much trust and faith in SADC because of the saying that we were in search of the entirety of the continent was in search of African solutions to African problems. So we had entrusted so much our leadership, as we thought that they had the capacity to steer through the Zimbabwean crisis to an amicable resolution. And what we have now clearly is that the majority of Zimbabweans no longer have confidence in the formal structures of SADC as an arbiter when it comes to resolving our issues. However, that does not necessarily mean that Zimbabweans must not continue to engage with the SADC. Our proposal is to continue pushing SADC. In fact, you can push SADC through actions outside engagements, and you can also push SADC through actions within engagement. And as Zimbabweans, we should not stop, and we will not stop engaging with our counterparts and our colleagues in civil society and outside the formal structures of SADC to mobilize each other, to make sure that the solidarity that they have offered to us as the people of Zimbabwe is kept alive.
But haven't you been doing that as civil society for the last 13 years, engaging, your colleagues in the region? But it seems that nothing, there's no solution to this crisis, and it's not working. Are there any other methods or tactics that can be taken in to ensure that things do change?
Well, the engagement with regional civil society is one angle of what we need to do. There are many other things that will contribute to completion of this puzzle. As Zimbabweans, inside Zimbabwe, it does not necessarily mean that we have not been doing anything, which is why you would agree with me that despite ZANU-PF's complacence in terms of accepting and implementing fundamental reforms, effort was made towards reform, and everybody would agree with me that we have a new constitution in Zimbabwe, which we did not have prior to the formation of the inclusive government. It is now our responsibility as citizens of Zimbabwe to make sure that any of the gains that we have achieved through the inclusive government are not reversed by ZANU-PF. So we must stand up to defend that which we have enshrined into our new constitution as the supreme law of the land. We know that the new constitution is an expanded Bill of Rights. We know that the new constitution also enshrines socio-economic rights. We know that the new constitution also has institutions that are aimed at political and institutional reform. The greatest tragedy that Zimbabweans would face would be to allow a ZANU-PF government and a ZANU-PF dominated parliament to reverse those gains. So as we look forward unto 2018 and the possibility of resolving this crisis in between now and 2018, our focus must be on ensuring that that which we have put up for ourselves, and we have said that we need a new constitution, must not be reversed. And I think if we focus our efforts on that, side by side with the kind of solidarity that I think we must not lose sight of, and we must not lose at this particular juncture, I do believe that one day Zimbabweans will be able to be moved to somewhere where we think is where we desire to go in terms of democratization.
Dewa Mavhinga, what do you see as the way forward?
Well, the proposition that is there is that human rights and freedom is not given on a silver platter. So this is the message to the people of Zimbabwe, that there is now need to go back to the basics in terms of mobilizing the masses, of being with the people. In terms of the democracy movement, the platform needs to be reviewed and to have a clear commitment to bringing Zimbabweans together to demand change inside of Zimbabwe. A rallying together, a coming together of different groups. At the moment, civil society has been atomized and weakened in parts, a number of groups in different ways. So there might be a need to come together now and to push within the framework of a broad alliance, and to really commit to a struggle and to realize that it will not be SADC, but the Zimbabweans themselves who will liberate themselves.
And Joy Mabenge says that people should continue to engage SADC. Do you agree with this? Why would people continue to engage with an organization that has proved to be, biased towards, certain parties in the country? What can you say about that, Dewa?
Well, I would agree that there is need to continue to push SADC to demand that it meets its own standards. Because the standards that you are talking about are SADC principles and guidelines on the conduct of democratic elections. And therefore, SADC must be held accountable. We need to hold our regional leaders accountable in terms of what happens, in terms of stability, and in terms of human rights respect. However, having said that, I would want to emphasize that it is important that Zimbabweans take a lead in this process themselves and not invest too much in SADC. We should not put all our eggs in the SADC basket, because it is not reliable. So the multi-pronged approach would have the front and center being led by Zimbabwean civil society and opposite political groups coming together. And then SADC would be supportive, but not taking the lead.
Ozias, earlier on you talked about how the SADC tribunal has been deconstructed. So how can SADC be held accountable then?
Yeah, I think a critical part of holding SADC accountable is to make sure that it is a people-driven institution. So the cross-border networking amongst non-state actors is critical in terms of in the home capitals to demand accountability right from that stage. And to hold the leaders who end up coming to Gaborone or going to the other regional capitals accountable, and to make that as effective as possible. I think within the region.
And I think we have just lost Ozias Tungwarara, but we've also come to the end. Hello? Thank you, gentlemen. We've come to the end of our program, and that's all for today's edition of First Talk with Violet Gonda. Thank you to our guests, Ozias Tungwarara, Director of the African Governance Monitoring and Advocacy Project, Human Rights Watch analyst Dewa Mavhinga, and Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition Regional Coordinator Joy Mabenge. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you, our viewers, for watching First Talk with Violet Gonda. Good night.